May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. Well, good morning, St. Paul's. It is so good to be with you. If we hadn't had the chance to meet yet, like Will said, feel free to come up to me after service, and I would love to get to know you and a little bit of your story. Although I'm a little worried because when I first interviewed here, Will referred to this as the priest crusher, so I might not make it out of here. But pray for me, will you? But St. Paul's, truly, I am so excited for all the ways in which we will be able to grow with one another. And it seems today we're starting off strong thanks to our lectionary. Honestly, the story of David and Bathsheba was not in my top 10 choices for my first sermon here at St. Paul's, but here we go. But as I read through the lectionary today, I kept noticing that within both our gospel message and the story we have of David's abuse of Bathsheba and Uriah, there is this common theme of human yearning. In our gospel, we see people who have either just heard of or in fact experienced the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. In this story, we see people who were just one day ago yearning to experience the healing power of Christ. And when they came to him hungry, something incredible happened. They were fed with not just enough food to tide them over or even just enough to make them full, but with an abundance that left them deeply satisfied. But despite that satisfaction, they come to Jesus the next day, yearning for more. They interrogate him, urging him to perform another miracle. They say, "We need another sign. We need you to prove you are who you say you are. Produce manna for us, as God did for Moses and our ancestors in the wilderness. Can you at least just do that for us?" But Jesus chooses not to satiate their desires, to be fed with more physical food, and instead he urges them to receive food by being fed through him with spiritual food, as he proclaims that he is the bread of life. He is the path to salvation. He is the path to ultimate satisfaction, and he is the answer to their yearning. And what we don't see in our lectionary today is the crowd's reaction to this urging from Jesus. When the crowd hears him proclaim himself as the bread of life, the path to ultimate spiritual fulfillment, they don't rejoice in this offering. Instead, it says they begin to grumble and doubt. This proclamation of spiritual fulfillment over physical fulfillment is one that is hard for even Christ's own disciples to sit with, and in fact, causes many to leave him that day. We can guess, but we don't really get to see how this denial of spiritual fulfillment through Christ affects each individual's life. However, we do get to see how this denial affects David in our Old Testament reading. In David's case, he has evolved from a shepherd boy to a warrior and now a king. A king with seemingly everything he could possibly want. He's got a palace, an abundance of food, he's got multiple wives, not to mention political power and influence. David was certainly not for want. And yet, he was clearly wanting. He was afflicted with this insatiable yearning for more. And this dangerous desire led him to ignore all he had already been given. to deny the spiritual fulfillment and favor of God he had been so clearly blessed with. And instead, he chose to prioritize his own physical fulfillment above all else. And devastatingly, he chose to take it by force. He took Bathsheba's bodily autonomy. He took the life of her husband Uriah, leaving her no choice but to comply when he took her from her home and into his palace. And we see in today's story the hard aftermath of David's yearning and David's taking. We see that David's want, his misplaced yearning, only led to more emptiness. Emptiness that now Bathsheba, his victim, was forced to bear, an emptiness that he was still forced to contend with, despite his best efforts. As his advisor Nathan recounts the story of the rich man and the poor man, we see that David is not ignorant to the matter of abuses of power. He cannot say that he simply did not know better. In fact, we hear David exclaim that the abuser in this story should have no pity and deserve severe punishment unto death for what he did. And then we can kind of see the gears begin to turn in David's mind. Perhaps the color drained a little bit from his face as his advisor Nathan pointed to him and said, "You are that man. You are the abuser." We see David fall from the pedestal he has set himself upon as he realized that he sinned against Bathsheba, Uriah, and his God. We see him panic as he realized that in choosing to take his own fulfillment, he has in fact lost it. We see this lament in today's psalm as he pleads with God to help him feel joy again, to create in him a clean heart, a right spirit, to please just draw him closer to God, to please help him be sustained through God's Spirit. And from this psalm, it is clear that David saw that fulfillment does not come from the abuse of power or from physical fulfillment or from taking. Rather, it comes from that which is already freely given. It comes from the spiritual fulfillment that only God can provide. In both these stories, we see people to whom God offered everything that one could ever need to be fulfilled. And yet, they both mistakenly believe that it is not enough, that they would be better off taking what they want for themselves. And we may ask ourselves, how can people who have been offered everything still remain so deeply unsatisfied? How can they still be craving more? I would like to offer today that it comes down to one emotion that I think we have all felt at one time or another, and that's fear. Fear that is rooted in a scarcity mindset that tells us we are not enough. We do not have enough. Fear that tells us that another person's good fortune is our lack. Fear that tells us that there are not enough pleasures or resources in this world for everyone. And if we want to meet our needs, we're going to have to take it for ourselves. You see, these lies permeate the very fabric of our society, so much so that it's hard not to take them to heart. I know that I have not been immune to them. But my friends, we all know the outcome of these fear-filled lies. We see it playing out in our own context. We know that this fear causes political and social divides divides that pit neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member. It causes toxic individualism that uplifts this us versus them mentality. It promotes things like racism, sexism, homophobia, and all sorts of abuses of power. Stories like the one of David and Bathsheba are hard readings, ones that make it difficult to say thanks be to God at the end. I certainly struggle reading stories like these, but the gift of this text and others like it in our biblical narrative is that through these flawed people, we, who are also flawed people, can learn that God is with us no matter what. And through God's grace, we can learn that we are called to be better, better to ourselves and better to one another. So whether you can find it in yourself to like David or not, there is undoubtedly something to learn from him. And that is that in our great desire to get what we want and to not be left without, we miss out on the great and awesome gift of spiritual fulfillment God is calling us toward and God is offering to us. As Paul notes in today's epistle, we are being called to cast aside fear and its abuses. We are being called to take on humility and gentleness in its place. We are being called to bear with one another in love, promoting unity and peace. Beloved, we cannot afford to be beholden to our fears at this time. Our world is hurting, and we are called to realize that we are far stronger when we allow our differences to unify us rather than to divide us. That we are far better when we choose not to take, but to receive. And we are far happier and more fulfilled when we believe and know that Christ is the bread of life, and that there is more than enough of him to keep every last one of us fulfilled and sustained. Amen.